Day to day, I suppose on the surface, I live a busy but quite a normal life. So I own this restaurant here, Summer House. I'm the operations manager of Alcatraz next door, which is a cocktail and coffee bar. I also have recently, in the last 2 years, branched into property. So I have a holiday let, and I'm currently managing building 2 houses, one which I'm going to live in, and one which is going to be a residential let. So I work 5 days a week. I have 1 day a week, which is a protected day, where I just go off-grid, sleep, don't leave the house. I need it to really recover, mainly from the cognitive fatigue. A lot of my life is talking to people, socialising, thinking, problem solving, and to be able to cope and not get overwhelmed, I need that downtime. So my mum just picked me up from school, normal day, and just driving me home from school, and sadly a motorbike tried to overtake us as we were just turning into a road near our house. The impact had massive repercussions for me. I was induced into a coma for 2 weeks, and then I was in intensive care. I couldn't walk well. I'd lost a lot of strength down my left-hand side, so I was almost partially paralysed. I didn't know how to eat. I didn't understand how to learn. My communication was still strong, but I didn't understand emotions, and I was having misunderstandings between short and long-term memory. People expect visible brain injuries. You've got visible and you've got invisible, and people really struggle to see that the invisible disability, like my own, is a thing. I feel brain injury is such a spectrum. It affects everyone so completely differently. And I always say to people, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. And if I'm seen to be behaving in a way that they perceive as normal or, from their terms, successful, that doesn't mean I don't have my struggles. I've had nearly 150 stitches in my head, and just because they're under my hair, people can't see it. Whereas, say for example, if those stitches were on my face or on the back of my neck, down my spine, people would be like, oh, okay, that explains it, there's obviously something wrong. But when I tell people I've had that amount of stitches or I've got a head injury, they'll always be like, oh, is that what the scar on your head is? Whereas my scar's just like a glass kind of impact scar. It's nothing to do with the actual injury. People just see me and think, young girl, she's doing all right. They don't understand the trauma and the journey that includes a head injury there, and how it could be possible to, from their point of view, succeed with a disability.
Jamie Lees is just one of the many untold stories of brain injury.
We want to share some of the challenges facing brain injured people in society.
We spoke to expert contributors about early years,
The criminal justice system,
and how someone's gender or sex might affect their experience of brain injury.
and aim to explain how we're helping to lead the way in understanding the family experience of brain injury.
This is Untold Stories.
Being 7 years old and having a brain injury was strange because you don't understand it, and you're very much reliant on your peers and your support network and your family to deal with the situation. You can't concentrate in loud environments. You can't process information or get the help you need in a class of like 35 people. Your brain's still growing, you're still developing, you're still learning as a person. So the full impact that it has, it's like I didn't realise the full impact of my brain injury until I was 21.
When a child sustains a brain injury at an early age, it can often go undetected in the classroom. So the teacher may not appreciate that that individual is struggling with fatigue, with understanding what she's asking them or he's asking them because of their cognitive dysfunction.
A lot of young people will come out of the hospital with nothing. Particularly children who've had, say, meningitis when they were 2, doctors will say, you're back to normal now. They will probably be absolutely fine through Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2. When they try to get into Key Stage 3, it's at that point that either the parents will remember the meningitis, will look into what it is. Some children lose a lot of their language, expressive language, receptive language, or they might keep one and lose the other. For some young people, they lose their orientation, and that might affect some subjects. It doesn't affect others. It could be about controlling themselves. It could be about expressing themselves, and they get very frustrated because they can't express themselves in the way they want to. It might be friendship issues. For any young person, the teaching style has to be something you can understand. I think most of us experience the idea that you have a really good year in history with one teacher. You change teachers, change year, and suddenly you hate history. And that's just magnified for somebody with a brain injury. Is that they are much less flexible. And also then they can't understand why that teacher can't really explain to them properly.
If the brain injury has been identified, they will be given an EHCP plan. The difficulty with some of those plans is that they don't give enough specificity. So, for example, they may say, well, this child needs 8 sessions of physiotherapy, and it won't say, well, that's weekly or bi-weekly.
I've talked to the parents about what an EHCP is and what it isn't in our particular local authority. If I were talking about in a different local authority, there may be some money attached to it. In the one I'm talking about for this child, there is not. It is just a description of the child, a description of what he needs, and some strategies that the school can follow. Every local authority has their own way of doing it.
This impacts in the child because it's not a level playing field. And we do, need to see it being levelled up from local authority and education authority to education authority.
The SHIPS project was set up from the hospital to cover the areas that the paediatricians cover. So therefore, I've got the experience of many local authorities. Others have thought, yeah, we're working fine within our local authority, not realising all the others around haven't got access to that. One person who is NHS could deal with anybody around the outside, but she couldn't go into one particular group because that area had not bought into the service.
There is hope on the horizon in terms of improving the services to children in the early years where they've got special educational needs and disabilities. There was a green paper for SEND and disability provision in England, with bringing together lots of stakeholders to input into how the services can be improved to ensure that there isn't this postcode lottery, and to make it more joined up, to involve parents, making it less bureaucratic and more navigable as a system. So I was very honoured to be asked to be part of Anchor Point, which is very much supporting the families of brain-injured individuals. We were aware as an organisation, Anchor Point, that when we were pulling together our response to the acquired brain injury consultation, that nothing was included in that SEND consultation about brain injury in children. So as a group in Anchor Point, through one of our representatives, that was fed back, making sure that we are looking at children too when we're looking at a strategy for acquired brain injury.
One of the problems, a couple of the problems when you have a brain injury is that actually making choices is very difficult. So you will not make wise choices. You will not make wise choices socially, and you won't make wise choices on the spur of the moment, so you can make a friend and keep a friend.
Unfortunately, following brain injury, many people become disinhibited and they become risk takers. And therefore, they come into contact with the police, they come into contact with the authorities, and after multiple contacts, it can often mean that they end up in prison through no fault of their own.
So there's several different areas that we're seeing coming out from the literature now that demonstrate that people with brain injuries are much more likely to commit certain types of crime. There really isn't any good understanding of how brain injury impacts on these particular kinds of crimes within the criminal justice system. And actually it requires legal teams to have a good understanding of that when they're representing a client, to be able to get that recognised in court. And even then, we still see many cases where individuals receive very punitive sentences because their brain injury is not recognised.
There's been some fantastic research done by Professor Hugh Williams and his team of looking at the prison population as a whole.
What we found was that about 60% had some kind of brain trauma history, and 17% had moderate to severe brain injury. So that's 1 or 2 in 10 prisoners have, a significant brain injury. So the prison population is full of people who have problems inhibiting themselves, stopping themselves doing something, and that's the mild brain injury, which is nearly half of them. And then you think about the other, 2 in 10 who have the moderate severe brain injury.
And when going into the prison system, sadly, the funding situation in prison systems is not good enough. We can't rehabilitate people with brain injuries, disinhibited behaviour, anger issues, dysexecutive function, put them into a prison situation. And it's just not going to work for them, I'm afraid.
The problem is it's clanky, it's noisy, there's massive amounts of drugs, it's chaotic, it's chaos. So despite being seemingly organised from the outside, it's actually horrendous. So if you look at a typical 15-year-old who has an episode of head injury, how much does that cost? Well, that episode costs £95,000. Healthcare costs, impact on family, impact on maybe mum or dad having to, not go to work for a week and look after and all the rest of it. The additional cost because of crime, because we know in 2 countries, US and UK, there's a cost of crime because there's data on it. So a murder costs 2.5 million. GBH costs 350,000. These are just examples, right? So we know what the cost of crime are. And because brain injury increases the chances of crime, the additional cost for every episode of brain injury in your typical 15-year-old, who's most likely to have brain injury, is an additional £65,000. So the actual costs are £160,000 per episode of head injury. Wouldn't it be better if we had better systems in place to manage that, rather than pay the price of sending someone to prison in 3, 4, 5, 6 years' time?
Well, it's fascinating to see that finally the government is getting behind putting an ABI strategy in place. And I know that there's a lot of work being done on that at the moment.
A pilot programme we ran in Devon and Cornwall Police with integrated offender management team was to pick up on brain trauma in the people there, enabling to stay in the community. We're not going to take you to court if you keep to these orders and you manage your drug and alcohol problem. If you manage this, manage that. Well, we identified more than half of them had a moderate severe brain injury. So maybe what if we texted you before you have your next probation meeting to make sure that you know when and where it is, and would that work for you? So yeah, thank you. And so you're having a conversation then about putting support in place so people aren't breaking the terms of their licence.
I do think the prison population provides a ready-made sector of people who could provide a lot of information, a lot of help and guidance to those in this sector looking to try and put together a pathway that covers all of the brain injury population. We see a lot of catastrophic brain injury cases, and those people have devastating impacts on their lives. Day-to-day life is affected, and an enormous amount of care and support has to go in to help them. Then there's those that don't quite fit that genre, those that have less obvious brain injuries.
Research into brain injury has predominantly been about male brains, the male experience, and written by men. And it's only the last 30 years or so that you had to include women in research. Before then, a lot of research was focused on male bodies. So it's a really emerging area, and there's some people doing some really good work here, but there's so much more that can be done to really understand how brain injury affects women.
One of the most striking human examples is, like, for example, crash test dummies, when they're crash testing cars and helmets and all sorts of safety equipment. The crash test dummy is sort of modelled on an average man. And then it's assumed that because that man is safe, okay, we can make that smaller, and the woman is just a mini man, and that's going to be safe for the woman as well.
The Disabilities Trust did research quite recently in the last few years where they found that the majority of women in prison have a brain injury, and the majority of those women sustain that brain injury through domestic violence. Women in prison, asking them about, have you had a brain injury? In other words, have you been knocked out a period of time? In actual fact, 60% had some brain trauma history that was relevant. One said, oh yeah, have been knocked out. Yeah, there was that time, I was knocked out. Do you remember much about it? Well, I remember looking at my face in the mirror, but I couldn't even see my face because it's so swollen. So there's a lot of brain trauma, and it's on repeat, effectively. So now we know that a lot of the women in prison have brain injury. We can do something about it.
Some work that was done by the Disabilities Trust recently was really powerful. They've got quotes from women in prison who are living with brain injury, and then they interviewed these women, and then introduced a link worker, which is like a key worker who's specially trained in brain injury, and in just small, simple modifications that can make the world of difference to these women. So memory techniques, appointment reminders, setting up more regular routines for the day, like sensory noise reduction, and just really simple techniques that calm things down and stop things from escalating. So there's some great people in this field that are looking into sex and gender in brain injury. So Professor Willie Stewart in particular is looking at sport and how that affects men and women differently. In his research, he's found that women are twice as likely to sustain concussion whilst playing football.
A lot of what we are seeing is research which is based on studies in male subjects with less evidence and less data on female subjects. And that's something we've been trying to address for the past 4 or 5 years, is trying to fill in that gap. Female athletes playing a sport where the rules are much the same, so say football, the risk of sustaining a concussion, sustaining a brain injury in those female athletes is about double what you'd see in the male athletes, all things being equal. Their time to recover from it can be slightly longer as well. All the evidence that's informed protocols for managing people with concussion is based on studies from male athletes. So, how to spot a concussion is all about male athletes. How to manage a concussion is all about male athletes. It's not about female athletes. And so if we're saying that the risk is about twice as high, that the mechanism is slightly different, and that the time to recovery is different in female athletes, we should be really thinking about possibly a different management of concussion in female athletes to male athletes. And that's where we are at the moment, is trying to encourage sport to think along those lines. The charity who's really leading the way in this is Pink Concussions, who are based in America, but also have started a UK contingent as well. And it's a really great website and group of people that are really highlighting the research in this area and regularly do talks with experts in the field and really shining a light on this area that just hasn't really been talked about before.
Pink Concussion started as a website. I figured I'd put the information up, and then the people that I was talking to, I could just refer them, and then they could go read it and they would move on. What it opened was floodgates. So more and more women came. So Pink Concussions has just mostly been a response from women coming forward to asking for resources.
For women, obviously, it's quite traditional that they take up more caring roles. If a woman has a brain injury and she has those responsibilities as a mum or a carer for a parent or anyone else, it just basically means that she doesn't have the same time and capacity to really recover from the brain injury and to focus on herself.
Societal differences in the roles women play is just huge, like you say, and there are people who have those caring responsibilities who can't take time away to do that, and quite often it is about coming together and supporting that woman and that person and saying, you need to go and seek help, and it's okay to go and seek help. And
brain injury itself is an untold story. It's a hidden disability. There's lots of people who lead relatively normal lives, but have all these hidden issues they're dealing with, and if you talk to them for 10 minutes, you just wouldn't know.